Let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that is the quarterback. Last season, we got to look into the future as Frank Harris battled injuries. So we got to see both Eddie Lee Marburger and Owen McCown both get some starts last season. As the season went on, Owen became that fill-in for Frank Harris. How did Owen and Eddie Lee look in the spring?
You know, it's interesting. You guys have talked to enough teams at this point that I think you're pretty aware of how coaches discuss these sort of things. It's always that everybody's even and it's a total competition and they're sharing snaps. And I think that they probably split the snaps relatively evenly through the spring, but it has seemed pretty evident for most of the fall that Owen McCown had sort of surpassed Eddie Lee Marburger on the depth chart. When he came in, Owen came in the second half against Tennessee and played pretty well. And then when they needed a spot starter in the bowl game, he was the guy. And it seemed like he was second on the depth chart everywhere in between. So coming in as a transfer from Colorado, he probably had a little bit of work to do to get up to speed in the offense the way Eddie Lee was. But eventually it seems like he got there. And now I would expect that he will be the guy going into the fall. They'll along the same lines, they'll tell you these guys are very similar players. They don't want anybody jumping in the transfer portal or thinking that they're behind. But generally it seems like Owen is a more kind of technical, maybe timing based, fits the system of the offense kind of passer, whereas Eddie Lee has been described as more of like a gunslinger, kind of more improvisational and kind of make things happen that way. So stylistically, there might be a little bit of a difference, and I don't know if that favors one or the other. It's probably all about how you can produce at the end of the day, but right now it seems like Owen is that guy. So I would expect him to be the one with the job. And, you know, in the spring, the parts we saw, they looked even, but I just think the track record at this point tells you that Owen's the guy who's in the front for that spot.
So fairly recently, I guess maybe towards the end of last week, they brought in they got a commitment from a transfer quarterback, Demetrius Davis, formerly of Auburn, but most recently from Alabama State. What should we make of that signing or commitment, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the way they've talked about this position because you go all the way back to signing day towards the end of last fall, and Jeff Traylor basically said, we told all the quarterbacks we talked to, if you want to come in here, you better expect that you're going to have to compete with Owen and Eddie Lee. And if you think you can beat them, then come on in. And if not, then maybe you should look somewhere else. And I don't know how exactly harsh he really was with all these guys, but I do think that it's pretty obvious that they didn't get somebody in that cycle and they didn't get somebody ahead of the spring signing day. And so we knew based on the fact that they had been looking that they were still looking for another experienced option who could, whether it's push those guys, which it might be, or at least give them another option who's seen college snaps before. So Davis, I think when you just look at his stats and what he's done at Alabama State, I obviously wasn't following it all too closely, but it doesn't seem like production-wise he'd be ready to step in and compete with those guys at the level that they're able to play at, especially having more time in the offense and understanding how things work. But you just never really know how a guy might click with a new system or a coach might unlock something in him. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, but right now it looks like he probably enters the year third on the depth chart pretty comfortably.
So it sounds like, Owen's probably the starter heading into 2024. But what would happen? You think what would he have to do or not do maybe to where you see a quarterback change and a switch to Eddie Lee?
Yeah, it's tough to say because Frank Harris was so entrenched the last couple of years that it never really came up. But if you go back to during Traylor's early seasons when they were still sort of feeling out whether Frank was that guy and what that might look like going forward in the program, they were not afraid to turn to another option or give other guys opportunities. And even last year when Eddie Lee started against Tennessee and they went to 0 at halftime, it seems like, I don't want to say they have like a quick hook for guys or whatever the case may be, but it seems like they're certainly open to the possibility of making a change if needed. At the same time, you don't want guys kind of looking over their shoulder and things like that. So it'll probably depend how much of a gap gets created in the fall. But if it really ends up being a tough decision through camp and there really is some thought that maybe Eddie Lee is actually the better option to begin with, then it could be a pretty tight leash. I imagine opening with Kennesaw State, you would think that UTSA would have a pretty easy time in that game. So that could be a path for Owen to sort of build up some confidence and some bolster his standing a little bit where it might be harder to him out and make a change. And then that could carry through any tough matchups that might lie ahead. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. It's hard to say.
Moving on to the running game, the Roadrunners bring back their top 3 rushers from 2023 in Kavarian Barnes, Robert Henry, and Rocco Griffin. How did that room look in the spring?
I think that's a group that everybody should be really confident in. I feel like those 3 guys have all proven that they can be pretty productive. And when 1 or 2 of them might have been banged up at different times last year, they turned it over to the other guys to just keep the offense moving. So that running back position, I think, is one that everybody at this point of the year should feel pretty confident in. And, it's no wonder that anybody that they add to that room is just a bonus. I think they're in a good spot there.
All right, talking about adding to that room, what should we make of the recent transfers? Former Texas Tech running back Bryson Donnell and incoming freshman, just a late flip here in Frankie Arthur.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how either guy is going to stack up. I think, if anything, it's an insurance policy, and then we'll see how the development process plays out. But you never know with the running back position in particular. It's so easy for guys to get banged up, and they love having a bunch of guys they can rotate. They've wanted to play more in the years past than they've been able to because of that injury situation. So all it takes is one guy to go down, and then you start seeing the 3rd and 4th guy get in the mix, and then it could end up that they make a pretty big impact. But from a talent standpoint, it's hard to say how they exactly stack up. And there's always everything you have to learn in a new system with, understanding your pass blocking and all the things that people might overlook initially.
So you have those 3 coming back, then you add these 2 incoming freshmen and transfer. What kind of split do you think we're going to see from this team in 2024?
Yeah, it's a really interesting scenario because it seemed like Kavorian Barnes coming away from his freshman season 2 years ago had really emerged as the guy. And he's still had a really solid season last year, but if you're kind of nitpicking or trying to separate all the guys, it seemed like he was carrying a little bit more weight and might have been less dynamic or explosive compared to his first season. And he had a couple issues with fumbles too. So by the end of the year, I think, and even at different points during the season, it felt like Robert Henry was the guy who gave defenses the most issues, where it was just like, how are we going to tackle this guy on a play-to-play basis? And, Rocco's a very solid player, and if he's faster than the other guys, maybe it's not by that much, maybe just a little bit, but he doesn't seem to run with the same ferocity as the other 2 options. So we might see more and more Robert Henry, but we could see if Kavorian Barnes comes in looking a little bit more like he looked as a freshman, then maybe he ends up being the guy. But I just don't think there's a wrong answer. It's probably the benefit for UTSA. However it shakes out, they should feel pretty good about who's back there.
When you saw Barnes in the spring, did he look similar to his 2023 self or his freshman year?
He was not really going full speed, so it's very hard to say. I think he was kind of limited by injury and just some stuff that you just don't need to put any extra miles on a running back at that time of the year unless he's 100%. So we didn't really see him kind of out there in the mix as much as some of the other guys.
So last year you talked about, Henry being that tough guy to tackle. Well, he almost doubled up Barnes and Griffin in the touchdown department. Is that something that you think we might see again here in 2024?
Yeah, I think he was pretty safe with the ball in terms of the not fumbling it away in those critical situations, and obviously had the propensity to fight for those extra yards and force his way into the end zone in those goal line situations. So I do feel like when they're down low, I think he's probably the guy they'll go to most regularly. If Kavorian or Rocco was going to score, it's more likely to be one of those 20-plus yard carries. And we saw them do that a few times last year and over their careers. But I think probably down near the goal line, Robert Henry would be the guy you'll see more often. So I think that could translate into more touchdowns.
All right. So given that you are the head coach for UTSA, you're trying to get into the playoffs. You're inside the 10-yard line. You got 4 rushes to score a touchdown. who is the one guy that's going to get all 4 touches?
Yeah, I think it's Robert Henry. I think it's got to be. But the good news is, like you talk about with the running back position, it's all about the fresh legs too, right? So if you need to give it to more than one guy, Kavorian's perfectly capable of being that kind of a physical bruiser. But I just think Robert Henry's more likely to be the guy who doesn't take no for an answer and kind of gets there.
All right, moving over back to the passing game, UTSA lost their top 2 leading receivers in 2023 due to graduation. Joshua Cephas off to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Tyke Ogle-Kellogg graduated. They do bring back freshman sensation Devin McEwen, Willie McCoy, and others. And let's not forget about a name people may have forgotten about, and that's DeCorian or JT Clark. In an article he wrote mid-November of 2023, he said that Clark would be out for a minimum of 10 months. So that kind of puts it like early, I guess, September timeframe. What can you tell about his recovery from that second knee surgery, and when do you realistically think we should see him back on the field?
Yeah, Clark's recovery is a really funny situation because that's probably the wrong word, but it's been intriguing because we spent all last year thinking his full return could come at some point in that 2023 season. And that was the case. We were kind of figuring out, through the spring when that would be and through fall camp when that would be. And he actually was on the field playing some snaps and some low red zone situations early last year. And the final stages of the recovery just didn't seem to progress the way that they had hoped, where he felt fully comfortable making some clean cuts and some of the lateral movement. And so ultimately, I think that's why they decided on that second procedure. So now coming back this year, when we go through the same kind of routine and I ask people, like, when's he going to be back or how's it look? They're like, well, we weren't lying to you last time. We thought he'd be back. But now that we've kind of seen this go haywire once, I don't know if we even want to try to put a timetable on it. You know what I mean? Like, they rather just see and hope. So we'll probably look at that 10-month time frame, which would put you kind of early in the season. And around, we'll be asking and we'll see what happens. But I think what we've learned is he seems, instead of being doubly discouraged or feeling like this was a setback, it seems like he's more confident in the outcome of the procedure and more ready to kind of get back on track. So I think that we will see him at some point. I'd be shocked if we didn't, but when is still a very, very difficult question.
So I'm going to assume it's probably a safe assumption that when he is ready, they're probably just going to ease him back into things versus sending him out there 100% from the get-go.
Yeah, I think that's what they wanted to do last year as well. We saw when they were going to put him in, it was those situations where he'd be more likely to just kind of go for a jump ball in the end zone, some of those close in kind of things. And that's because you don't really have to make the same kind of cuts and movement across the field laterally. And so I think maybe whenever he's ready, you might see that same kind of progression where he eases in that way and then expands to the full menu of offense, unless he's just that ready once the season gets here, which would be kind of a miracle. But I do think, you'll probably see some progression in that sense.
All right, well, let's get to the rest of the receivers. How did the rest of those guys look in the spring?
You know, it's funny when you were doing you guys sent me the little outline and you were just telling us about the past, and I was ready to send you a correction. There's no way Tyke was the second leading receiver, because it felt like Devin McEwen had established himself as that guy and as a real threat. But I think that really speaks to Tyke was not a guy that necessarily from year to year or game to game you felt like you were going to get that consistent level of production or that you could super rely on compared to some of the other guys. And McEwen, on the other hand, even though the end result wasn't as high of a total as what Tyke was able to put together, for him to come in as a freshman and do what he did was really kind of a revelation for this team. And he was really fast, just looked ready to play at the college level. And when you look at this receiver room overall this year, when you have Devin, of course, and then you have Willie McCoy and you have Chris Carpenter and you have DJ Allen, the transfer from TCU, it's a lot of guys who are right about 6 foot. They're really fast. So the speed is what sort of sets that room apart. And then to round out that room, they have the size threat in JJ Sparkman, who comes in and is kind of replacing, and whether JT Clark comes back and is that guy as well. But right now it looks like JJ Sparkman is kind of that replacement for the taller target who you can kind of throw it up to and he can make a play. And we saw him do that a couple of times in the spring game. So overall, I would say the outlook for the room is pretty strong. We will see, because you don't need all of those guys to be great, right? But if you can get a couple of them to rise up to the level that McEwen is at, and one of the whether it's Sparkman delivers the way it seems like he has the potential to, or if JT comes back and to provide that different style of threat, then I think they have a pretty well-rounded room there that can stretch teams vertically potentially.
So you talked about transfer JJ Sparkman and what kind of role we might see from him in 2024. But what about the TCU transfer DJ Allen? what do you think maybe they have in store for him for 2024?
Yeah, I know. Obviously, they spoke highly of him, as they do of just about everybody this time of year. But I think probably more of a me problem than a him problem. But I didn't see him jump out in the spring practice the way some of the other guys did. So I don't know if that maybe lowers the expectations or not, just for me personally. But they've said really strong things about how he's just as fast as anybody else in that group, and I think could easily end up finding a role. I just find it a little bit harder to project because he didn't make a lot of these standout plays that I might have seen where some other guys, you look at the sheets, oh gosh, who was that? So yeah. I think maybe we see any number of guys emerge, or the depth chart could shake out any number of ways. But right now, Sparkman is the one of the two transfers that I would expect to have the bigger year, just based on kind of what he's flashed so far.
So last year they brought in another freshman, and if you had told me, hey, a freshman's going to make some noise at UTSA, I would have said it was this guy, David Amador. How did he look in the spring?
Yeah, that's a good point. I did a story on him, and we were able to talk to him in the spring, and he was the guy that really through the fall and as early as signing day was highlighted as a guy that they thought could come in and play right away. And it was interesting. I think it was one of the first couple of drives of the season. They got him the ball on kind of a sweep play. So you understand that they saw some potential that with the ball in his hands, he can make some things happen and be kind of a dynamic threat for this offense. So we will see how that role sort of expands in his second year. I think there's certainly more wide receiver snaps available with the two guys that are gone, and he could end up being a guy who might factor in pretty well in the slot where Joshua Cephas slid into that role for most of his career, even though at his size he profiles more as a perimeter guy, but just because they needed somebody who could sort of take that mantle. And maybe David Amador is the next kind of guy who can play that interior receiver role and make a big impact there. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him have a pretty big season. But to your point, yeah, it was maybe not all the production was all the way there last year, but I think you saw some of the reasons they were excited about him.
So come that the first game at home against Kennesaw State, who do you think are the starting receivers?
Yeah, it's really tough beyond McEwen. Like McEwen, I would say you can lock in as number one, and then after that, it could go any number of ways. If I had to guess right now, I think you will see Sparkman, just based on what he's flashed and the potential he has, and sort of offering a different profile, I think is important too. You probably want a more dynamic set of receivers rather than three guys with the same skill set. And then the third option, I think I'd go with Willie McCoy. I don't know if we talked about him much, but he had an injury scare last year where he was down on the field and ended up having to be stretchered off and was out for a few weeks until he came back in the bowl game. But they've talked a lot about him since he got here, of just the kind of dynamic threat he can bring as he was a return specialist in JUCO and had a lot of success there, and has flashed a little bit of that here, but certainly has the speed to make that work, and I think was developing as a receiver before the injury. So he, based on the overall picture of what we've seen from all the guys who were considering for that role, I think has the inside track to it. But that one could easily be, whether it's Chris Carpenter who emerges, another guy with that sprinter speed, or whether it ends up being Amador, or if it's DJ Allen or whoever else. There's a lot of guys who could factor in there.
So UTSA also returns a solid tight end group: Oscar Cardenas, Houston Thomas, and Dan Dishman. Last year, Cardenas ran the third most routes on the team and was fourth in targets, receptions, and yards. Should we expect the same type of usage for Cardenas in 2024, like we saw in 2023, or with the turnover at the quarterback position? And like you said, that wide receiver room is kind of ambiguous right now. Do we maybe see an increase in his role?
It's so funny because he's been around the program so long, Oscar has, and he has 82 catches and just shy of 1,000 yards in his career. But the way he comes through in big moments, I mean, he had a home on that highlight video, I think at least once or twice, that in these times where they really need a big catch, he's the guy who seems to come through with it. So you could convince some people he had 82 catches for 1,000 yards in any given season, because it just feels so monumental a lot of the times. But he's a guy that's going to be super interesting to keep an eye on this year, because I think as they got towards the end of last season, he was thinking about his NFL prospects and didn't necessarily like the reports he got back. There were people talking about whether he might profile better as an offensive lineman or some kind of blocking role, rather than feeling like he's a tight end who can make plays at the next level. And so we talked a lot through the spring about his efforts to get in better shape and maybe cut up to 20 pounds or so. And it seemed like he made really fast progress there. I don't know that we saw a lot on the field in the spring that was so wildly different, but behind the scenes, they really rave about the progress he's made and the commitment that he's made to chasing that improvement. And so it'll be fascinating through the fall to see if he is able to sort of assert himself as a real receiving threat that translates into an NFL prospect, because that's obviously the goal at this stage in his career. And it's just something that hasn't necessarily materialized in a huge way, but he has the size and athleticism combination that's pretty rare that he certainly could get there. So I don't know if it's fair to expect more or less. He's probably going to want more in the offense, right? If that's what you're trying to prove. So we'll see if that's how it translates. It's probably just going to come down to how much that commitment to be in better shape and show more in that way holds through the summer and the fall when, it's pretty easy right away to get inspired by something, but how does that carry into the real season? And can he live up to that potential that he feels like he has?
Let's move over to the offensive line. They bring back their left tackle, Vinley Tatafu, center Luke Lapizzi, and right guard Corey Godnett. But they do lose 4 offensive linemen in that room to graduation, 2 of which were starters, and left guard Terrell Haynes and right tackle Ernesto Alvarez. What do they do to kind of fill those losses along the offensive line?
Yeah, I don't envy you guys for having to try to figure out what this offensive line looked like the last couple of years, because it's really been all over the place. Whatever, 2 seasons in a row, it's whatever idea they thought they had coming into the season has ended up with 1 or 2 injuries that wasn't even necessarily just plug in the next guy. It was, we'll move this guy over here, and then we'll get this guy off the depth chart and put him over at that position, and you end up with a guy like Walker Beatty, who is a defensive tackle first and foremost, ends up moving over to the offensive line and trying to fill in on that side. And so it was all over the place. But I think the way to start looking at this year's offensive line, I think it centers around Mekhi Hart at right tackle, who has barely played the last 2 seasons, just like 2 games last year, and I think 2 games the year before that, but previously was an all-conference guy. And so he comes into the year at 25 years old, but he will be a guy that I think could be a starter and probably the best offensive lineman they have at tackle. So then everything else kind of falls into place from there, because you have at left tackle, we had a guy, Buffalo Cruz, that we talked to a lot about coming in here as a JUCO transfer and thought that he might be a big impact, but he dealt with some injuries and never really saw the field as much as might have been expected. So then that's how you end up with Vinley Tatafu, who was recruited as a guard and they thought he was going to play guard, and then 2 years ago had to move the tackle to fill in. Coming into last season, it's okay, we can put Vinley back at guard. He's going to be at his position that he wants to be in, and then more injuries, and he's back out at tackle again. So at least right now, I think the plan once again is that finally he ends up at guard where he's supposed to be. And so then from there, Luke Lopez was another guy that was filling in for an injury. Wasn't necessarily supposed to be the starting center last year, and I think bringing in CJ James from New Mexico will have a huge impact. I actually think he started at center in the spring game. I imagine that he will be that guy going into the fall as well. So really the only one that's probably going to be about what we were used to from last year to this year is Corey Godinette, who you mentioned at right guard. So if everything goes to form on paper, they have a very strong unit. It's just that the last couple of years, nothing has gone to form. Although that just makes them more and more prepared for when, if other situations pop up, they have guys who are ready to slide into different roles.
How did the unit look in the spring? Did they look like they were ready to, protect the quarterback and open up the holes for the running back?
Well, it was pretty much a shuffle as well, because Mekhi Hart's not back yet. So it was an injury that's going to be keeping him out until at least kind of, I think they said now was about the time they'd evaluate when he'd be ready to get back on the field. So they were still sort of shuffling and experimenting. And I think that's why we saw some different guys at tackle that maybe we hadn't seen before, whether it's guys they've recruited previously or transfers they brought in, like Kamar Missouri and Jalen Garth. Both have a chance to end up contributing depending how it works out. So I think it was still kind of a period of experimentation. They sort of, rather than thinking, let's get our 5 and try to build chemistry, especially with Mekhi out, let's just sort of experiment. And you would see different groups, different days, and different guys working at different spots. And so hard to say exactly how strong they looked, because I think it was so much experimentation. But I think talent-wise and experience-wise, I think they're in a position where they could have a pretty good season.
If you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season here in 2024, who would that be?
Yeah, I think the obvious one would be Devin McEwen, but it's sort of like cheating to pick the number 1 receiver and say he's going to have a big year. So I think the more under the radar guy would be Amador. I do think that it wouldn't be shocking if he ends up in a starting role, whether it's towards the end of the season or sooner. And I think they might find some other creative ways to get the ball in his hands, because they're just sort of confident in what he can do and that he's going to make the smart play and protect the ball and all those little things that their coaches love.
We talked a little bit about McEwen, but I mean, do you think that with this season, he'll kind of be the wide receiver 1 and the potential 1,000-yard receiver for the Roadrunners?
Yeah, it's interesting because he's from East Texas. He played at Jacksonville High School, and Owen McCowan played at Rusk, which is also an East Texas school. And so they have kind of a connection. They work out over the summers and things like that. And so I feel like that could just add another layer to his sort of readiness to step up and contribute into that top role, to have some good chemistry with this probable starting quarterback. And so I think just from what he's capable of and what he's shown already and those connections, and I have a strong belief in the offensive system too. I think externally there's probably a lot of doubt about, can this team produce at the same level without Frank Harris? But I think just the way it's schemed up and drawn up allows them to have a lot of success, and that maybe Owen McCown's arm talent might actually open up some other things that Frank Harris wasn't able to do. So I think they'll still probably produce at a pretty high level. So that should translate into a big year for the number one receiver.